Welcome to Business Innovators Radio, featuring industry influencers and trendsetters sharing proven strategies to help you build a better life right now.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to Business Innovators Radio. This is your host, Constant Taylor. Today, we have a very special guest on the show, and they're going to share some very exciting information with us. So, if you're looking to increase your personal and professional effectiveness, then you've come to the right place. Our special guest today is Dave Cornell. Dave has been speaking professionally for several years, and the content that he primarily speaks on is courage. He's spoken primarily nationally and is based out of Minnesota. He has a book coming out soon called Cultivating Courage. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Constant. It's great to be with you.
And it's great to have you. Now, I just want to clarify that the book that you got coming out, that is a working title and that could possibly change.
Correct, yes.
Okay. Well, I'd like to kick off the show by asking you if you could tell the listeners a little bit about your speaking business and how you help your clients become more successful.
Well, Constant, thank you very much for having me on. And what I like to do is work with people and organizations. I do both coaching and speaking, but work with people and organizations on developing courage. Courage is something that we don't talk a lot about in courage and fear, are topics we don't talk a lot about in our daily lives. It seems we've reserved the word courage for policemen and firemen and soldiers and people like that. And yet we all have opportunities in our daily lives to be more courageous. As an example, if you're a salesperson and you have a fear of calling on a client or a potential customer that is huge and you've only dealt with smaller customers, you might place a ceiling on yourself and say, oh, I could never call on a customer that big. And so that's what I do is I work with those people to eliminate those glass ceilings they place on themselves so that they can become more successful and more fulfilled in what they do.
What is the first step in removing the courage? It's one thing to say, hey, be brave. And then there's another to actually, step through the process of actually manifesting that.
Yeah, and really the very first step, again, coming back to the fear now, I often say that we can have fear with no courage, but we can't have courage without fear. So the first thing that we have to do is be willing to admit that we have a fear. We have to be willing to name it. I say it's like being an alcoholic or a drug addict. And until you're willing to say, I've got this problem, you're not going to change it. And so you have to be willing to say, this is what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of failure. I'm afraid of success. I'm afraid of embarrassing myself. Whatever it is, you have to be willing to name your fear before you can move forward. That's the critical step to getting started in the process of developing courage and cultivating courage in your life.
So what are two popular misconceptions about the product or the service that you provide, and how do you dispel those?
Well, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is just that I'm not sure that even misconception is the right word, but it's just something that we don't talk about very much. We don't talk about the fear that we have and the courage that we have, and people often feel that they're the only insecure one in a room. I can remember as a young guy working in the corporate world, sitting at a desk at a meeting table, conference table with, a bunch of bigwigs from the company I was part of, and feeling like I had something to share and had something to say, but feeling I wasn't smart enough or hadn't been around long enough. And so I just kind of stayed there in my shell. And so people often feel that they're the only ones that feel that way. And so I think that's one of the misconceptions is that, you can be sitting in a boardroom and everybody in that table, sitting at that table, has some level of fear that needs to have some courage to overcome it. So I think that's one of the biggest things. And just getting people to recognize that there is a better way to do it. And talking about the process of beginning with naming their fear is the first step. And that's what I try to do, is to get people to recognize they can improve in this, and they aren't the only ones. So let's step forward and let's step out in courage.
So if you were to look at the perfect prototypical prospect or customer to say, hey, this is a person or this is an organization that I can definitely help, what would that look like?
That's an interesting question, and I'll tell you very honestly, it's one that I wrestle with because I have had the opportunity to work with C-level executive groups and opportunities to work with lots of sales groups. I would say the group that I love to focus on is the sales group. They say that there's that old 80-20 rule where 80% of the sales come from 20% of the people. Mm-hmm. So that means there's 80% of the salespeople out there who are only bringing in 20%. And I love to work with those 80% to help them to recognize that they can be better and they can become part of that 20% if they're willing to step out of their comfort zone, if they're willing to admit what their fears are, and to begin to take some steps of courage that will help them be better if they're willing to step forward and do that. So sales groups is one of the areas that I love to work with, but I've worked with all kinds of different kinds of organizations as well.
Okay. Now, when you look at your superpower, your secret sauce, that thing that you do very well that you bring to the table to help them, what would you say that is?
I think one of the things that's really helpful for me in this process is in my speaking, I tell my story of the fears that I found in my own life that had been with me into my 50s. I'm now 60 years of age, but there were a lot of things that held me back, things that I didn't want to talk about. And so one of the words that I often hear when I speak is, you're so authentic. And it's just, I can relate to what you have to say. And so I think that's one of the pieces of the secret sauce is just telling my story and being open and vulnerable with it and having people recognize that, wow, this guy feels like I do. And so maybe there's hope for me. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a big piece of what I bring to the table that is very helpful for people.
Authenticity, that is very important. Now, what do you think is the main reason that a prospect would decide not to utilize your services?
When I first started doing this, I focused on the word fear. And I wasn't getting any or very little business. I was getting business from friends and, people that knew me, but people didn't want to bring anybody in to talk about fear. Mm-hmm. And so then when I changed the topic to courage, my talk is virtually identical to what it used to be. But I think it's the thing of getting people to recognize this goes on in their offices, in their place of business, in their churches. It goes on with their people all the time, and yet it's just never addressed. And they can become so much more productive as an organization if they're willing to address the topic and get it on the table. It will help them. It will help them as individuals, but it will also help them corporately to grow. Mm.
So, looking at your journey, what adversity really sticks out in your mind? Talking about, being vulnerable and, having fear. What sticks out in your mind as the adversity that you overcome, and what did you do to deal with it?
Well, this all started really back in January of 2010 when I lost my job in a downsizing. A year later, my wife lost her job in a downsizing. That was at a time when there were very few jobs to be had. The economy was not good at all, and it didn't matter what age you were, but nobody was getting hired. And if you were, in your mid-50s, the chances of getting hired were slim to none. My wife and I went through all of our savings. We ended up having to sell our home shortly before being foreclosed on. And our lives were put in turmoil. I recognized at that time through some very serious and intense counseling, because I was diagnosed with situational depression. I recognized that if I'm not going to get hired, what have I done in my past that I can create and do that can generate an income?
Mm-hmm.
And one of my passions had always been to be a speaker. But I never thought I was good enough. I never thought I had a story that was worthy of hearing. So I started to just kind of develop this talk around courage, recognizing the fears that I had in my life and my unwillingness to deal with them or talk about them, and began to talk with other people who were unemployed, and they talked about their fears and those. And so for me, that was the impetus, was losing my job. And I talk about never underestimate the value of a crisis. It was one of the most difficult times in my marriage for my wife and I. We talked about divorce, which we'd never done before. But it was that time, as difficult as it was, that I look back on that, and I'm very grateful and thankful that that happened, because that was the catalyst to get me to where I am today in starting this business that's now making a difference for the people I have an opportunity to speak with.
Was it one day that you woke up, or was there one flash, or did the idea of being a speaker kind of evolve over a short period of time?
Well, the idea of wanting to be a speaker goes back to when I was 28. And so it had festered for a long time. I attended several different job networking groups when I was unemployed. And I kind of started to, one of the things I had been encouraged to do during my counseling was to journal. And so I began to just jot my fears down and began to deal with those. As I visited with others, I recognized that there were other people that had fears similar to mine or very different, but these things never got talked about. And so then the idea of developing a talk around that was when it started to develop. So it wasn't I woke up one morning. It was definitely a process thing that developed over a period of time.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm not sure if you utilize this as tools for your clients, but I think journaling and writing down things that are inside of you is very important, because what I find is that, something's swirling around in my head and it's like this huge big monster, but once I actually get it out on paper or on tablet, it's not that scary anymore, and it actually there's a huge release of anxiety. It's like, wow, this isn't so bad.
Yeah, and that is, Constant, that is actually one of the parts in my talk. I talk about recognizing your self-talk. What goes on in your head? What are the things that you say to yourself, and becoming very familiar with those and writing them down? And that, just as you said, that writing them down takes some of the power away from them. And it's just an amazing thing that when you're writing it, it just removes some of that stigma and some of that power, and having that awareness of those negative thoughts so that you can then do something to turn them to a positive view, as opposed to just dwelling in the stuff that's going on in your head.
Yes. Now, with the last minute that we have here, I would like for you to convey one thought, concept, or principle to the audience, so that if they don't get anything else out of our discussion, this is what I want to leave them with. What would that be?
That would be, Constant, I think, just the idea that we all have these feelings and these insecurities and these fears that we're not good enough, that we're not as good as that person that has created and generated this great success. And yet, if you talk to those people, you'll hear about their failures, you'll hear about their fears and how they worked through them and overcame them. And that we all, regardless of those insecurities and fears, if we're willing to name our fear and begin to take steps, we can all achieve, maybe not that level of success, but we can achieve and do things that we never thought possible simply by stepping out and cultivating courage through addressing our fears and working to overcome them.
Very powerful words of advice. Now, if the listeners would like to contact your organization, learn more about what you do, and possibly engage with you, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Well, I'll give you my website, www.cultivatecourage.com. And my email is simply dave@cultivatecourage.com. And I'm happy to give a phone number if you're open to that too, Constant.
Absolutely. Whatever you're comfortable with.
952-200-7499.
Dave, thank you so much for coming on the show. That was very powerful information that you shared with our listeners, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Constant. Great to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to Business Innovators Radio. To hear all episodes featuring leading industry influencers and trendsetters, visit us online at businessinnovatorsradio.com today.